Episode 9, The Ruins, the season finale. In the future, we see someone walking in the woods in the rain. We don't see who it is though. As they continue to walk, they walk up to the old covered bridge. The man walks through the covered bridge and they notice the hole in the bridge. They then see dried up blood in the wood, and then they keep walking along. As the sun is starting to rise, the man walks into a post-apocalyptic, burned-out suburban estates. As the man walks through, he continues on his journey. We see he's walking through the woods, and he now discovers the old army base. We see him find the old burned-out ranch. And finally, as the sun is starting to set, he sees a post-apocalyptic Washington, D.C. As the sun sets, we see the man walking along a river. The man stops for a sec. It's nothing but silence. And then we see something washing up, and we see it catches the man's attention. He walks over to then find an old skeleton in the water. The man looks at this and says, "Well, how did you get here, sweetheart?" Currently, as we see Sydney sitting by the water with a gun in her hand, she says to Luke, "How did we get here?" Luke says, "Surviving." Sydney says, "Yeah, I wonder if it's going to catch up to us eventually. Like all of this is a test. All we do is take risks." And Luke says, "Everything's a risk now, Sydney." And Sydney nods and says, "Huh, maybe." As she and Luke start walking up the hill back to the cabin. And as they walk up the hill, they walk into the cabin, but we see someone is watching them from far. Lindsay and her vipers are watching them from far, and David asks, "So we doing this?" Lindsay has a smile on her face and says, "Aw, look at this beautiful family reunion here. It kind of brings a tear to my eye. And there'll be a lot of tears when the sun goes down." And David says, "These are monsters who will pay the price." And Lindsay says, "I don't run from monsters. They run from me." Flashback. to 2 months after the outbreak. Lincoln is walking the roads when he then finds a car. We then see it still has a half tank of gas, and Lincoln then gets inside and starts driving. As he's driving down the road, we see a picture of his family in the passenger seat. He then keeps driving, and then he sees a woman up the road. The woman is standing on the side of the road saying, "Help! Please stop! Please!" Lincoln sees her, and he looks like he wants to keep driving, but out of the goodness of his own heart, he stops. The woman is running towards the car, and she gets in the passenger seat and hugs Lincoln and says, "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." And Lincoln asks her, "Are you alone?" The woman says, "Yes, I'm totally on my own." "Oh, thank you so much." And Lincoln says, "I'm Lincoln West. What's your name?" The woman says, "I'm Sarah." And Lincoln says, "Well, Sarah, I'm going to let you come along, but I'll have you know I'm on a very important mission, and I won't be stopping for anything." And Sarah says, "What's the mission?" And Lincoln says, "Look, I may have just let you in here, but I don't know you. So for now, I'm just gonna..." Lincoln's window is smashed. A man with a gun tells him to step out of the car. Lincoln looks pissed and steps out. Sarah gets out of the car and she walks over and ties Lincoln up with rope. The man has a gun pointed towards him, and Sarah says to Lincoln, "We're sorry. We need all you have." And Lincoln looks pissed and says, "I need those supplies. Look, please, we can share. I can help you." The man asks, "You got his keys?" Sarah says, "Yeah, let's get the hell out of here." And the man and Sarah get into the car and drive off with all of Lincoln's supplies. Lincoln is standing on the road tied up as he watches them drive away, as he now has nothing left. No weapons, no food, and no car. Currently, we see Lincoln found a car as he's driving around on his own looking for his people after the fall of the city. He then sees a woman walking alone on the road who looks to be pregnant as she's saying, "Please, please help me, please, please stop." But Lincoln just keeps driving. Lincoln looks like he wanted to stop, but he tells himself, never again. As he keeps driving, he now is only focusing on his people rather than others. We then see later on his car runs out of gas. Lincoln then steps out and says, "Shit," as he goes to check the gas tank. A viper comes out of the woods and tackles Lincoln to the ground. The viper is trying to drive a knife into Lincoln's head as Lincoln is trying to keep the knife away from stabbing him. The viper says, "For Lindsay." Lincoln then sees the viper's leg has burn marks on him. Lincoln gets the upper hand and kicks the man in the leg, and the viper falls to the ground. The viper gets back up and draws his machete. Lincoln then draws his machete, and then the viper swings at him. Lincoln ducks and tries to swing at him, but as the viper punches Lincoln in the face, we see as they're fighting, the dead are coming up the road. Lincoln slashes the man in the shoulder, and the viper then headbutts Lincoln, and Lincoln falls to the ground. As the viper's arm is now bleeding, Lincoln then falls and hits his head on the road, and it knocks him back. But as the viper starts running off into the woods, he leaves Lincoln to be eaten by the dead. As Lincoln tries to get up, he pushes a few of them off of him, but then as he picks up his machete off the ground, he kills a few of the deadheads in front of him. He takes his gun out of the car, and then he breaks off into the woods to hunt down the viper. As you see the viper running through the woods with a smile on his face, we then see Lincoln shoots him in the arm from a distance. We then see the viper runs away and he enters an old church. We see him run into the church and he closes the door. We see him sitting inside in a panic as he's got no bullets left. He's bleeding out and now he's been shot. As he's trying to figure something out, we then hear the doors open. Lincoln slowly walks in, and the Viper looks scared and he's in pain. And he gets on his knees and says, Okay, I give up. You win, okay? Please don't. Lincoln walks up to him and says, Shut up. He pistol whips him and the Viper falls. Lincoln points the gun towards him and says, Where is she? The Viper says, I don't know. And Lincoln says, Of course you don't. And the Viper says, If she's still out there, she's out for blood. You should probably give up now while you still can. Lincoln shoots him and ends his life. Lincoln then looks at the cross as a huge ray of light starts shining through the window, and Lincoln walks up to the cross and says, I don't know what I am to you. A murderer? A father? Or a hero? Ever since you decided you wanted to go ahead and change the world into what it is now, I lost my family. But then I got them back. You made me think I could settle down. Be the person that I was supposed to be. And 3 months later, you took them from me. And instead of sitting there, I did something. I stepped up. I killed the people that hurt my family. I lost my family by trying to be good. And now, I lost my family because I did something. What do you want from me? Who am I supposed to be? I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for something, a sign. Give me a reason. Lord, give me a reason to live. He then hears people outside of the church. As he slowly walks up to the door, he has his gun out, ready to fight. He opens the church door. As we see a huge light shining on him, we see a big smile on his face. Back with Tom and Julia. As we see they made it out, they stop for a second to get a breather. Tom says, I think we're good. Julia says, Thank you for saving me. I honestly was considering just ending it. And Tom says, Don't worry about it. I wasn't gonna let you die, kid. And Julia asks, Where's your friend? I never had the chance to thank him for what he did for me back at the bar. Tom looks emotional and says, He didn't make it. And Julia looks sad and says, No. And she starts crying and says, How did it happen? Tom says, Billy and I were in a fight with a madman. He killed him right in front of us. Julia wipes her tears and says, I'm so sorry. He was a good man. And Tom says, Yeah, he was. And Tom says, We should go. There could be more of them out there. And Julia says, Yeah, my mom's gonna find us. And Tom stops for a second and asks, Your mom? Julia looks nervous and says, I didn't want to come with you. Trust me, I'm as good as dead. And Tom says, Who's your mother? Julia looks scared and says, Lindsay. And Tom looks shocked to hear this and says, The Queen? That's your mother? Julia says, Let me explain, please. My mom, she always wanted to protect me. She never wanted me to get involved in her fights. But when you guys attacked, I saw her for who she really was. She kept talking about a group called the Outlaws. But every time I would try to talk to her, she would try to cover it up. And now I know why. Tom says, "Look, kid, your mother has killed people that I've cared about, people my friends cared about. We went in there for justice, to make sure that it would never happen again. Your mother is responsible for a lot of horrible things, kid." And Julia says, "I know she is. You see, she was like this before and we got her help. But I thought she finally got better. Maybe she finally changed. But I was foolish. I thought she could have been better, but it was always there. This is who she's always been." And Tom says, "Look, your mother, that is your mother. And no matter what, that's still your mother. And I promise, I'm not going to hurt her with you there." And Julia says, "Thanks. But I don't know if we can go back. I don't know if I can go back with you, Tom. When your people see me, when they know who I am, they're going to kill me. They'd have every reason to. Man, I'm just as much of a monster as she is." And she starts walking away, and Tom looks at her and says, "Hey, you listen to me. You are not a monster. I've met several monsters over the past year, and you are not a monster. You're a good kid that was in the wrong place at the wrong time." And Julia is crying, and Tom says, "Hey, listen to me. No matter what I'm gonna have to do, I'll never let anything happen to you." Julia says, "You promise?" Tom says, "I promise." And she hugs him, and Julia's crying, and Tom starts to cry as they hug each other. But as Julia looks behind Tom, we see a man approaching them. We then see it's Miles. Julia takes out her gun and points it towards Miles. Tom says, "Hey, it's okay, kid. He's with us." Julia looks surprised, and then we see Dave, Haley, and the families from the city all walk up to them. Dave approaches Julia, Miles, and Tom and says, "All right, everyone, let's all cool down and put our weapons down, shall we?" Julia puts her gun down and says, "You made it." And Miles says, "Yeah, it's a long story." "Wait, you heard I was dead?" And Julia says, "Yeah, Lindsay's people said that Steven told her you died." And Miles looks sad and says, "He did what I asked. I'll be damned." And Dave says, "I got these poor people out, and on our way by we found Haley. We patched her up and we kept moving." Haley walks up to Tom and hugs him and says, "Glad you're okay." And Tom says, "You too." And Tom asks her, "Where's everyone else?" Dave says, "We're still looking." And Miles says, "You know who this is, right?" Meaning Julia. And Tom says, "Yes, I do." And Haley says, "Wait, who is she?" Miles says, "That right there is the Queen's daughter." And Dave says, excuse me?" Miles says, "Chill out, brother. She's one of the good ones." And Dave looks super mistrusting, and Tom looks at everyone and says, "It doesn't matter how she came here, or where she's from. She's a scared kid. That's all that matters." And Miles says, "I can second that." And Dave says, "All right, we don't have time for this shit. Let's go find our people." And they start walking together to find everyone else. As you see them walking, we see Tom says to Dave, "You got them out? All of them?" Dave says, "Wasn't gonna let them die. Look, I know you're never gonna trust me, but I'm here for the long haul. And I'm here to help you finish this thing with the Vipers." And Tom says, "I'm getting that." And Dave says, "But I know you can never trust me," and Tom says, "I hope you can make me trust you." And Tom keeps walking. They then hear a shot. Everyone pulls out their guns. As Dave, Miles, and Tom slowly walk ahead, they find the church. Lincoln opens up the door and Haley runs up to him and hugs him. Lincoln walks out and hugs Tom, and he even shakes Dave's hand, and he sees all of the families behind him. Lincoln says to Dave, "Good job." As he shakes Miles's hand too, and Miles says, "You got it, Mr. West." And Dave says, "Well, looks like we're the only ones that survived so far." And Lincoln says, "Yeah." And Dave sees the dead viper laying in the church, and he says, "I see you had a little trouble." And Lincoln looks back and says, "Just a little." And Dave says, "All right, let's go find our people." About a mile from the cabin, we see Derek, Clay, and about 10 soldiers scouting around, making sure there's no one around. As they're about done, Clay spots footprints on the grounds. Sydney radios them from the cabin and says, "Clay, what's your status?" Clay says, "We haven't found anything yet except for some footprints. From what I can tell, they look fresh." And Sydney says, "Okay, we know what we know. You can come on back." And Clay says, "You got it. Man, these Vipers are nothing without that city anymore, I gotta say. I mean, they really are pathetic." Out of nowhere, Derek, Clay, and all of the soldiers get blown up. Sydney and the others hear this from inside the cabin. Sydney picks up her walkie in a panic and says, "Derek, Clay, what's going on out there?" No one answers, and Sydney and the others look worried. We see Sydney, Luke, Kezia, Roger, Amelia, and the rest of the guys look all scared as we see Sydney says, "We gotta go." We get out the back and we cut through the woods. "It's our only choice," and Roger says, "Are you sure?" Sydney says, "The only thing I'm sure about is that we're not dying tonight. So yes, I'm sure." We see Sydney, Luke, Kezia, Roger, Amelia, and the last few soldiers that have got left. They all run out the back and run through the woods. We see everyone running as fast as they can. As everyone is running through the woods, they keep on going. Five big trucks all light up in front of them. Sydney and everyone looks terrified as the Vipers step out of the trucks and surround them from every direction. Lindsay walks out and says, "Guns on the ground, now!" Sydney looks pissed and they all give up their weapons. Lindsay then walks up to Sydney and says, "Well, hello again." "I tried to tell you. You should have been careful." She looks at Sydney and says, "You know, I thought about just killing you instead, but then I thought, it would have been too easy. Turns out, that would have been the best thing I could have ever done." And Sydney starts laughing and Lindsay says, "Is this funny to you?" Sydney says, Yeah, it is. You had Chris and these people turned against us. You had all of your people turned against us. Yet somehow, we ruined your world. Yeah, that's pretty funny to me." Lindsay looks pissed and Roger says, "Are you gonna kill us? Huh? Is that it?" Lindsay smiles and says, "Do you have any final words, Sydney?" And Sydney looks at her with a cold look in her eye and says, "Tread lightly." And Lindsay turns around and says, "David, take the girl out first." Out of nowhere, Lincoln, Dave, and the others all come rushing in, killing several of Lindsay's men. Lindsay and David see this and start running away. Lincoln yells, "She's escaping! Don't let her get away! Go!" We see all of Lincoln's people chasing after her men. as Roger and the others pick up their guns and help. Sydney then spots Lindsay running off into the woods, and she chases after her. Sydney starts shooting at David and Lindsay. As they're running, David says, "We're losing, my queen." Lindsay says, "We don't lose. I never lose." We then see David get shot in the chest and he falls to the ground. Lindsay tries to help him, but then she sees who did it. We see Sydney with a gun from a distance. Lindsay starts running. Sydney fires a few shots, but she gets away. Sydney then runs after Lindsay. We see David in pain as you see Lincoln and Haley walk up to him, and we see him begging, "Please, don't, please." Haley looks at him and says, "For Blake." And she shoots him and ends his life. As you see Lincoln watches her do this, and Lincoln says, "Come on, let's finish this." We see Miles slicing up several vipers with his swords as one of them tackles him to the ground. Dave shoots the last viper and gives Miles his hand and says, "You alright?" Miles thanks him and says, "Yes, boss." We see Lindsay is still running as she steps out in front of the river. We see her hiding behind a tree. We see Sydney fired her last shot. As she's looking around, we don't see Lindsay anywhere. Lindsay comes up behind her and knocks Sydney to the ground. Lindsay says, "Well, you're not so tough without your friends now, are you?" And Sydney says, "My family. You killed my family. Only problem is, you didn't kill them all." She kicks Lindsay to the ground. As Lindsay falls, Sydney then starts punching her in the face over and over again. As Lindsay's getting her face beat in, Sydney is saying, "For Emma, for Ryan and Macy, for Paul, for Blake, for Mom and my dad." As Lindsay screams, Lindsay headbutts Sydney and pushes her into the water. Lindsay keeps Sydney under the water as we see Sydney running out of air, as we see her hand is reaching out of the water. As Sydney's eyes are starting to close, we see her hand is going from stiff to weak. Lindsay is starting to laugh as she's spitting out blood, and she says to Sydney, as Sydney is about to die, "The Queen always wins. The Queen always wins. The Queen." Lindsay gets shot in the head. Julia lowers her gun and says, "Goodbye, Mom." And then she runs over to Sydney and helps her out of the water. As she pulls her out, we see Amelia and Kezia run up to her and help Sydney out of the water. Lincoln walks up to Julia, and Julia asks, "You're the leader of the outlaws?" Lincoln nods and Julia says, "Well, I declare your war is over, Mr. West." And she walks away and starts crying as we see Tom hugs her and Lincoln walks into the water and he looks at Lindsay's dead body and says, "Lord, I know the answer. Thank you for protecting my family." And Lincoln walks up to everyone and says, "Well, this is over. It doesn't change what we've lost or what we've done. But we're alive. We're here and together. And we will build a life where no one will ever be able to take it from us again. We go home. All of us. Not just because we helped each other. Because we're family. We see a beautiful sunrise as we see everyone getting ready to go back home. We see all of the trucks are leaving, and we see Lincoln, Haley, and Dave. As Haley's getting in the truck, we see Lincoln walk up to Dave, and he says, "We won." And Dave looks out at the sunrise and says, "We sure did, Mr. West. It wouldn't have been possible without you." And Lincoln smiles and says, "It wouldn't have been possible without all of us." And he taps Dave on the shoulder, and as you see Dave gets into the truck, we see Tom ready to head out, and Lincoln walks up to him and says, "All right, we won. And frankly, I've waited long enough. When we started this, I told you when this war was over, you could kill him," meaning Dave. And Tom looks back at Julia in the truck, and he says to Lincoln, I think I'm okay." And Lincoln looks relieved, and Tom says, "We've been through enough, and that girl has a whole life ahead of her. And you're right. I may never trust him again, but he's a big reason we won, and I'm not going to let that count for nothing." And Lincoln smiles and says, "Okay." And Roger honks the horn and says, "Hey, yo, you guys about to give us a full makeout session, or are we moving?" And Lincoln says, "I'm coming." And they all get in their vehicles and drive away. But as Lincoln is ready to go, he tells Roger, "You mind taking them back?" Roger says, "Sure, why?" Lincoln says, "I'll be back. I got something I got left to do." As Lincoln walks away and watches the trucks drive off, he has a big smile on his face and says, "You gave me the sign. I know what to do." Two months after the outbreak. Lincoln has managed to get his hands untied from the knots, and when he looks down the road, we see the car died on them. Sarah is saying, "What's wrong with it?" The man says, "Just give me a second, damn it." Out of nowhere, Lincoln drives a machete right into the man's head. Sarah then sees Lincoln covered in blood, and Lincoln picks up the man's gun and shoots Sarah through the windshield. And we see this was Lincoln's first kill. Currently, he finds the same pregnant lady walking the streets. When Lincoln pulls up, he gets out and says, Hey, it's okay. I'm not here to hurt you, okay?" The woman looks a bit scared, and Lincoln says, "I come from a place not far from here. We've got water, food, electricity. You can come back with me if you want." The woman says, "Is it safe?" Lincoln says, "Yes." And the woman looks desperate and says, "Thank you." And she and Lincoln ride off together as he now has helped her. Two weeks later. We see Kingstonville. We see people working and people rebuilding. As we see Lincoln walking around with a smile on his face, we hear Dave's voice as he's narrating. "Dear Dad, I always thought there'd be more time. I remember when I was a little boy, every day I'd see you leave for work and I'd thought, man, I'd love to do that someday. As we zoom out on Kingstonville, we see Lincoln and Haley's new house. As Lincoln looks out the window at a thriving community. Five years later. Lincoln is looking out the window, and Tom opens the door and says, "Lincoln, you ready?" Lincoln looks back at Tom and says, "Yeah, I'll be down in a sec." And Tom walks out, and Lincoln grabs his machete on the table, and then he walks downstairs. Lincoln walks downstairs and walks into the kitchen and kisses Haley and says, "Good morning, babe." Haley gives him a plate that she has ready for him and says, "Here, if you and Tom are going out today, you're going to need full stomachs first." And Lincoln says, "Thanks, but Tom really wants to get going." And Haley says, "Oh, don't worry. You're not the only one getting a full stomach." We see Lincoln walking into the dining room to see Tom eating some breakfast, and Lincoln says, "I thought you wanted to get going." And Tom says, "But bacon, pancakes, and eggs are priority, bud." And Lincoln sits down and starts eating. We then see Lincoln's son, named Billy, runs up to him and says, "Are you leaving, Daddy?" Lincoln says, "Only for a couple days. Me and Uncle Tom will be back before you know it, Billy." We see Lincoln and Tom heading out as he says goodbye to Haley and Billy. As Dave's narrating, "We're now 5 years later, and I still think about you every day. I think about how you fought every day to save this country, to save these people. As we see Sydney walking by to her house and checking her mail, Dave says, "You risked your life every day for both of us to have birthdays, school, jobs, barbecues. You made it all. You made that all possible, Dad. I know I probably never thanked you enough, but I thank you now." As Dave is doing some yard work, Dave says, "I'm a father now." As you see, his little 3-year-old girl walks up to him and says, "Hi, Daddy." And Dave says, "Hey, Rose." As Dave is narrating, "I have a wife and a daughter who you gave me the chance to raise. You believed in this place. You wanted this place to work. And even though it took a while, it finally happened." We see Miles training a bunch of people with swords. Dave says, "The place you wanted it to be is real." As you see Lincoln and Tom pulling out to go on a run. Dave says, "You showed me that, Dad, and I'll never forget. I love you." Dave. We see Lindsay as a skeleton, laying dead in the water. We see the man walking and continuing on his journey, when then he stops. We see Lincoln and Tom driving by in a truck, and the man then comes out of the woods and stands on the road. The man is watching them driving away from far, and the man says, "I'll see you soon, Lincoln West."